Okay, guys, thank you very much for your patience and welcome again. Today, as our title slide there said, we'll be looking at planning for a cloud server migration in your F21 budget. I'm going to give you a quick intro to CubeSys and a little bit of background, and then I'm going to hand over to Chris, our senior cloud engineer, who's going to take you through a whole bunch of content to help you plan for that migration to the Azure cloud. Before we get started though, let me make an acknowledgement of country. I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditions, customs of the land, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Our agenda for you. So as I said, I'll just give you a quick introduction to CubeSys for those of you who don't know us. And then we'll be passing over to Chris, who's going to take us through that cloud server migration and budgeting for the next financial year. So what are the things that we need to consider and how would we get there? Chris will be covering off the migration drivers, the journey that we need to go on to get you to cloud, talk about Azure landing zones and Azure blueprints. So we'll go a little bit technical as we get towards the end, and we would love to have some questions and answers for you from you as well. So we'll have some time at the end to return to those. A little bit of housekeeping from me first. We will be recording this session, so it will be available afterwards, and of course we'll share the slide deck, so all that will be good. And again, those questions at the end. There is the ability to ask questions through this event, and we'd love to hear them. Please post them anytime. We'll try and answer them as we go, but we'll also have that dedicated session at the end of the event. CubeSys, who are we? CubeSys has been around for 8 years now. We're over 20 staff based in Sydney. We work with a wide range of clients, as you can see from some of those logos there. We have a large presence in government, in healthcare sectors, and over the last 18 months we've had a real focus on the not-for-profit sector. And we're very pleased to say that we've been able to help a number of not-for-profits leverage the cloud and start to see some of the benefits and agility that cloud provides our customers. What we do, CubeSys are a focused Microsoft partner, so we've been a gold partner with Microsoft for over 8 years. And our company value there that you can read along the bottom is we really want to be able to democratize secure cloud solutions. And not just for those really big clients and enterprises that we work with in government departments, but for all sizes of organizations. I think one of the things that we really want to try and achieve for our clients is to use the smart approach of DevOps, automation and intelligence services to really leverage those benefits of cloud. So we want to help you understand those and make sure that we can help you and your businesses benefit from them. And we focus on 2 main pillars, which is the Microsoft Azure cloud, which is what Chris will be talking about today, but we also Microsoft 365, which is of course Windows 10, Office 365 and the management and security suite that comes from Microsoft. So we do a lot of work in that area. Comment from me before I hand over to Chris. I thought it was interesting to pull up what's happening in the world, and of course, as we are now working from home and impacted by COVID, we're seeing even more of this, and the growth in cloud is definitely accelerating. So there's pretty big numbers there from a global standpoint, and we're seeing even more growth happening. So I think it's absolutely imperative, I think, for most businesses to be able to make use of cloud services and bring their businesses into a modern era, allowing us to work remotely, securely, and leverage those benefits of automation. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Chris, who's going to start his presentation.
Good morning, everyone. I obviously won't have our camera on throughout the presentation, just so that I'm not looking up and down all the time, looking for my notes. But I just wanted to say welcome along. As you can see, I'm the senior cloud consultant here at CubeSys, and you can always reach me on LinkedIn, but you can also reach out to me in many other ways. So cracking straight into it. So today's agenda, so we're going to look at migration drivers. We're going to talk about cloud elasticity and look at some of the cost considerations and optimizations that kind of come with drivers towards migration to cloud. We're going to speak briefly about the migration journey, about planning out your cloud adoption, and also looking at some migration tools. We're going to touch on some landing zones. So landing zones are a concept of frameworks that you can use to look at network identity and organization and governance. And then we're going to touch a little bit more on some of the Azure Blueprint. I will have a tool summary just to kind of briefly recap on some of the tools that we've kind of spoken about today, and then we'll wrap up with some questions. So kicking straight into it, migration drivers. So these are the typical migration drivers that I see a lot of my customers facing on a day-to-day basis. And they range from things like cash flow challenges. Some people are not so familiar with the OPEX versus the CAPEX cost modeling, and that can be a driver in some cases. Business continuity can also be a really big challenge at the moment, especially around the scalability of on-prem environments needing to scale up very quickly and having that business continuity plan in place. So that's kind of covered off rapid scale and also a bit of business continuity. The ability to meet the surge of demand is important with cloud. The elasticity of a cloud is all about making sure that your company can meet the demand and the need of your platform or service in a very quick and scalable way. It's also about cybersecurity threats. So this might also be about reducing your threat landscape and I guess your threat area and reducing that into a more consolidated approach. Or it might even be just as simple as your data center's contract is coming up for expiry and you're starting to see that the cost of maintaining your data center is becoming too cumbersome and too big, and cloud may be an option for you in that space. So how can migrating to the cloud help you? So converting, like I said, from a CAPEX to an OPEX model. So CAPEX being the capital expenditure, the money that you spend on buying new hardware and buying new services or software regularly and replacing that hardware over time. To an OPEX model, which is more of a monthly consumable model. So where you're paying just a monthly bill to consume the product or service. You might also be looking to enhance your security posture. And migrating to the cloud, customers can see that cloud providers give them some improved security postures because they take care of some of the back end, some of the ISO compliance components, some of their PCI style compliance requirements, and so on. And also scale. So like I said just before, cloud and moving to the cloud is all about making sure you get the scale to your people, to your product, and to make sure that you've got the scale focused in the right areas. And it's also going to increase your productivity, your operational productivity for your staff, because you're not going to have to focus on maintaining the VMware instance or the physical hardware underneath it. You're focused on delivering the application and the platform. Optimizing costs during and after migration. So cost optimization is a really important piece of any cloud adoption kind of strategy or discussion. And there are a couple of ways you can kind of realize this. So during your migration, or even pre-migration, you can even look at something like the Azure total cost of ownership calculator. And again, these links to these kind of tools will be inside the slide deck, which we will send out. Making sure you right-size the environment by using tools like Azure Migrate, which can do an inspection inside your environment, give you an understanding of what your environment needs and what scale it needs to be placed into. Things like the Azure hybrid benefit is also a really key piece around making sure you're optimizing your cost around your licensing, and that's obviously specific to something like Azure. And joining the migration program. So speaking with your Microsoft representative or speaking to partners like CubeSys, we can talk to you about migration program and about saving you some money on your actual migration costs. And then post-migration, we're talking about things like using your best practice recommendations and looking at something like Azure Advisor, which will allow you to look at things that are being underutilized or overutilized, or things that are being idle for so long that could be shut down. It will give you those recommendations to optimize your costs during and post your migration. Implementing controls around Azure policy is really important because from a governance piece, you can make sure that you're only deploying, for example, the right virtual machines in the right areas. And it gives you an ability to put some guidelines around where your resources are and what resources they are. And finally, monitoring your bills through Azure cost management is really important about making sure you've got those budgets and those allocations of spending defined and controlled within the environment. This allows you to have that granular control around every piece of your environment.
I think it's a super important point, actually, Chris, because if you're not in cloud today and you're moving that direction, it's a new discipline, and it's a discipline that needs to be tracked and managed almost every day, right? And when we used to set budgets before in the past and buy equipment to put in our data centers, that was a very different cycle, right? What we need to do today is make sure that's optimized on a daily basis.
Yeah.
I think it really is a good idea to reach out to partners like CubeSys and get some help doing that when you get established.
Yeah, and that's just it. Everyone thinks of what about budget? You know, I've got a budget to spend this much on high hardware this year. Well, that goes away, but it moves to a conversation of how much do I have to spend today? How much of that my budget can I consume today? And that changes the mindset of the people that are managing it. So being slightly Azure and Microsoft focused, here is one of those famous Microsoft slides where they try to beat up Amazon. Now, obviously, you know, not every cloud is right for every solution, but in this example, we've got a SQL server and a Windows server. And this is about highlighting that you would pay less because of the Azure hybrid benefit. So in a hybrid benefit scenario, you've got software assurance on your licensing, and what you can do is maximize the reduction of cost by moving yourself into a platform as a service, for example, in the secure one, the SQL environment down there on the bottom right. And at the top there, you've got an illustration around the Windows server savings. So, you know, again, comparing it directly to Amazon. So you're still paying for the Windows license inside Amazon, whereas under hybrid benefit inside Azure, you're going to have some of those cost savings. And then another big piece around the Azure versus Amazon battle is the SQL performance and the SQL costs. So this is our best performance on price. So this is about talking about a specific instance, and you can see down at the bottom right, it's very, very cut off. It might be just a little bit cut off. It's essentially the VM sizes that are being compared here. And you'll get, what Microsoft is suggesting is that you get a 3.6 times faster performance based on your transactions per second. But over a 3-year pricing model, it's roughly 84% less cost.
Microsoft's approach to SQL and the different services they offer on the Azure platform is one of the most significant areas for savings and benefits. So most of our clients have seen a really good improvement in their management of SQL by moving to managed instances, which gives you that server capability, but without all the management overhead, right? And so Microsoft help look after that. And then when we look at that price point between Microsoft and AWS on those particular workloads, really is quite a compelling story from them. Right? So an area to, if you're big users of SQL, absolutely you should be looking at that.
Yeah, and we're going to talk briefly about the SQL modernization in a few more slides down. One of the other things you need to always consider and remind yourself of is the multi-tiered, multi-layered security approach that occurs. And this can happen in a few different ways. Security management is an important way to assess the security state of your environment continuously, especially as cloud workloads change so quickly and dynamically. Azure Security Center can really help you understand those changes and understand the impact of that on your threat level. One of the interesting facts I've always found about this is that people don't necessarily know this, is that inside the Azure Security platform, there's roughly 8 trillion threat signals per day. And that means that they're processing all of these different threat signals from many, many areas and applying any of those threat identifiers inside your environment. The other thing around this is around identity and access. Again, keeping in mind that you've got to have an ability to take your identity-based approach to security and establish a conditional access policy, for example. So a conditional access policy is allowing you to define the boundaries and borders of your users or your customers accessing your environment. You also need to consider things like app and data security. You need to be able to protect your app and protect your data both at rest and in transit. And it's something to consider when you're specifically having a publicly exposed environment, for example. And the network security components. You should always kind of try and remember that, you know, every cloud still requires some form of network connectivity, whether that's within its own cloud or whether it's external or internal or into your on-prem environment. You need to consider how you're going to secure that network and secure that environment for yourself and for your customers. Here's a slide around enhancement of your business continuity. Again, we've talked about this is one of those kind of key drivers around continuity. And one of the things you can understand here is that built in under these cloud kind of services are things like Azure Backup. So Azure Backup is an automated platform and process around taking snapshots, just like you would in Veeam or VMware, taking snapshots of like a virtual machine. Or you can use it to automate your current backup. So you can actually move your Veeam-based data store or repository into Azure using Azure Backup and having that almost off-site approach to your backup approach. It allows you to do some recovery of your data and your applications very quickly by maybe extending your on-prem environment via something like Azure Site Recovery. And you can move it from your on-prem environment to the cloud very quickly. You can also consider things like virtual WAN, which is more or less an Azure version of a software-defined WAN where you can connect your locations, your office locations, into your Azure data center, making it feel a little bit more like the replacement of a data center rather than a pure cloud environment. And always to remember that there's always high availability across these components, and also the fact that that's about bringing your continuity up to that level. Now, the cloud operation responsibilities. I get asked the question every now and then around what are my responsibilities today and what will my responsibilities be in the future? So this is a pretty common slide. I'm pretty sure most of you would have seen it in one way or another over many years. But essentially, towards the left is your on-prem infrastructure, where you and your IT team are purely responsible for managing the entire environment, everything from the network stack all the way up to the application delivery. And then as you move more to the right from an infrastructure or a platform or a software as a service, your responsibility starts to decrease, and the managed services provider or the managed provider, Azure or Amazon, for example, then create that or take on that responsibility for you. Now, obviously, software as a service, the most common use case around that would be Office 365, something like Exchange Online, where you've moved from managing your Exchange environment on-prem all the way through to the far right, where you've just more or less offhanded the whole responsibility to the provider, Microsoft, and you're just now responsible for more or less provisioning your user set. So it's an important thing to remember because it's a reduction of your responsibilities, but not necessarily your duties. And one of the other things that I do talk about a lot is a cloud operating mindset. So moving to the cloud also requires you to change the way you approach, manage, and maintain your traditional infrastructure. So a traditional infrastructure engineer needs to consider more of an agile structure to the way they think about the infrastructure. Here at CubeSys, we use a term called Azure Factory. And as a part of our daily operations, we have to look at almost every cloud piece as a bit of a project, and every project has a business need. And a business need, just like a project, it's a driver of adoption or a driver of change. You would normally have that business need sent to someone like an architect, a solutions architect. In this case, we've got an Azure architect who might be looking at developing the solution that's needed. He would probably work with someone like, and I'm going to use a term here called IAC, which is infrastructure as code. So that architect would then either work with a developer that might be deploying or has learned how to deploy infrastructure as a code inside the Azure stack. We would then look at deploying that environment. So we might do it into a test environment or into a staging style environment. We would then operationalize that environment. So we then take those learnings and take that implementation and build it out and make it operationally ready. And then at that point, we might have someone going in to test it, and we might get some feedback loops. So we might have operational improvements that come back to the developer, or maybe even towards the architect. Or the developer might have some feedback that has to go to the architect for re-architecture, which is always kind of interesting as well. And then we might go through that whole process again, and then click the go button and go to that production environment. Now, those that are looking at this and kind of thinking, or coming from a bit more of a development background, going, hang on, I know what that looks like. And of course, it is the DevOps approach. But in cloud operations, from an infrastructure perspective, you need to have an understanding of, well, I recommend you have an understanding of the DevOps environment because it does allow you to adapt, change, and grow, not only in your infrastructure, but also in the way you operate your infrastructure in the cloud. So, migration driver summary. What have we covered off? So far, we've covered off some of the common reasons why people or companies kind of look to migrate towards cloud. I've also showed you some slides around how Microsoft likes to beat up Amazon, but it's also about understanding some of those effectivenesses, the effective kind of savings you can look at for specifically SQL workloads inside the Azure environment, and also the context of Azure Hybrid Benefit. We discussed very quickly the multi-layered security considerations and some of the business continuity considerations, and we spoke briefly about the cloud operations mindset.
Probably just make one comment on that, Chris, as you're summarising. It's probably to set everybody's thinking around that is that we're finding with a lot of our clients when we assess their on-prem landscapes, ready for cloud migration, that security is often not as robust as you would think, and actually moving to cloud, if it's done well, can be more secure and put you in a better position for security. There's a lot of very well structured security done by Microsoft and Amazon under the hood, and as long as we adopt that well when we move workloads to the cloud, we can actually make things more secure than we can on-prem.
Yeah, and it's about making sure that we use that as the framework, as the baseline, and we make sure that we implement our requirements on top of it to complement it. We shouldn't be ever trying to circumvent it. We should always be looking to complement the security landscape that's already implemented by the vendor. So we're going to talk now about the Azure migration journey. So the migration journey is a bit of a complex beast, and as the next slide will demonstrate. So I guess one of the things I wanted to say here is that, like the title would recommend, no migration is ever simple or linear. So this is a diagram, this is a Microsoft diagram that's provided to us, built out of a lot of different engagements over a lot of different times, and you can see here how you kind of go from the business strategy into understanding if you need a partner or not, going into your business cases, and then building out your plan. But then you might find you need some technical skilling, or you might need to engage a partner at that point. You might need to then look at your landing zone environment and understanding how those landing zones come together and how they can be deployed and delivered in a consistent approach. And then you look at your migration execution. So it might just be your end-to-end test planning and your actual migration support or post-migration support. And then we'll look at things, you might then, after that, if you're looking at purely just getting migration, you might then post that, look at some of the security compliance and also governance things. So cloud operations is about making sure that you understand what you're implementing, what you're moving into, and what's required to maintain that environment moving forward.
This is a very complex slide there, Chris, and are you scaring people and how much work there is to it?
I'm not trying to scare anyone, but I guess what I'm trying to suggest is that everyone's approach is going to be different. Everyone's approach is going to be unique. And this is by far probably one of the more complex ones I've seen, but there are some really simple ways of getting to the cloud.
Yeah, I think that's probably an important point before everybody runs away going, it's so complex, it's too much. Yeah, there is one of the true benefits of cloud is that we can use patterns and automation, and we can achieve a lot of this stuff extremely quickly, right? And we can reuse a lot of IP, so we can help our clients adapt that very quickly, right? So although yes, everything is very unique for every client, and there are different challenges, and it does look complex when you first get that. It's pretty phenomenal what we can achieve in the timescales that we can achieve them in.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to touch on in a few more, maybe in another section later in the deck, would be around the cloud adoption framework, which is a really strong baseline framework that can be used in almost every migration project that really kind of sets that grounding foundation of what you need in place to move quickly and effectively and repeat the process.
Yeah, that's good.
So here are some common migration projects that I've kind of come across over my time. Windows Server and SQL Server being the most obvious ones. Linux and open source databases I've started to see a little bit more in. We all know that dev test is normally the first target for a migration project because it's simply the least impact in most cases. Web apps is another really strong one, and there's a few things around modernization of web apps versus rehosting of a web app. Now, SAP is not something I do a lot of, but I have seen a few of them. I've only participated, I think, in one. And then there's the specialized workloads where you might have something like an Oracle stack or a NetApp stack or a VMware stack, which you might want to migrate or rehost essentially into the Amazon or Azure, sorry, specifically the Azure space here. or the VDI environment. And for those that missed it, we actually did a really strong session on the Windows Virtual Desktop just on Tuesday. And if you want to get access to the recording of that, just send us an email. We'll definitely flip that recording over. It's a really good session around some of the big benefits of moving from your traditional VDI environment to a Windows-based virtual desktop, which is provided by Azure. So an app service, just to kind of go into a little bit more detail in some of those more common projects. So an app service is an ability to scale your web app, more or less on demand. So you might take your, for example, web server that's running a .NET website or a .NET application, and you might be able to deliver that into an app service pretty much with very little effort, keeping in mind your identity, your security, and your network connectivity, but it's then automated for the load balancing. So you're essentially then, the app service is going to be load balanced, and it's going to have that built-in auto scaling, so it's going to scale on demand. So as the application becomes busy, it's automatically going to scale up so that you've got more capacity to continue servicing. And it's also got those automated migrations with the app service migration assistant. Again, there's a tool that's specifically built for app service migration, and it's unique around looking at your code, deploying that code into an app service and having it ready to go. The SQL on demand. So I want to talk briefly about the difference between an infrastructure as a service approach and a platform as a service approach. A simple rehost of an environment would simply be you currently have a SQL server in I'm going to pick on VMware today, a VMware virtual machine, and you simply want to rehost that. You can simply take the base image, build out an infrastructure as a service virtual machine inside Azure, and deploy SQL inside that IaaS. And that's a very lift and shift approach. If you wanted to look at modernizing your application and modernizing your database infrastructure, you would look at something more like a managed instance. That's the first kind of best example. And that would be more or less, you no longer have to manage the SQL environment itself, but you're conscious and you're maintaining the database level only. And then the same thing for the Azure SQL database, which is essentially the best for just supporting cloud apps. If it's a simple web app that just needs a backend database that's fairly static, it is by far the best platform for that particular use case. Oh, and again, here we go. So the virtual desktop. So, like I said, we did have a really good session around this just on Tuesday, presented by George, one of my colleagues, and he did a really good session around bringing that VDI experience that you have using Citrix or VMware Horizon, for example, into the Windows 10 multi-host supported platform on Azure called Windows Virtual Desktop. Now, that's a very unique requirement, but it's built for scale, it's built for optimizing Office 365 Pro Plus, and it's the only Windows 10 multi-host supported environment. So if we dive a little bit deeper into migrating some of these workloads, so here's a really basic rehost. So we're literally going from VMware stack on-prem or Hyper-V stack on-prem, and we're going straight into an infrastructure as a service offering where we would have Windows virtual machines running web apps and Windows virtual machines running SQL databases or MySQL databases, for example. So it's a very basic, and we can achieve that very quickly using the Azure Migrate platform, where we just plug in on the on-prem environment, target your subscription or your landing zone or your environment inside Azure Cloud, and we click the Go button. A modernized version of that would be, again, kind of leaning towards that app service kind of model, because it is a very simple one for people to kind of understand. We can look at, again, using the Azure Migrate for the server migration, which would be moving just the web app, the .NET code in this example, into an Azure app service. And we look at using Azure Migrate database migration to the data layer, where we might be going, again, this might be just a pure web platform with a very basic or static kind of SQL environment. So we'd be looking at just using the Azure SQL platform as a service. So it's a real modern version of delivering the same thing on-prem.
So why would we consider doing that, Chris? What's the benefits of moving to PaaS?
Well, I think, again, if we think about our operational responsibilities and our operational mindset, it's going to enable us to scale really quickly. It's going to also enable us to keep that operational requirement or I guess internal requirement for management away from us and move it more towards the actual provider.
So we're removing the need to manage an operating system, right? To secure it, to patch it, to operate that, right? And letting that be done by our cloud provider, so we can lift up the workload and remove effort from our side, right? As IT guys.
Yeah, we're removing that requirement for us to be involved in every layer of the environment and moving it to more of the core focus of something else. We don't have to now manage the SQL environment or the operating system of that virtual machine, and we can now focus on something else.
So we're actually lowering our threat vector, we're lowering our total cost of ownership because we don't have to manage that VM. Right?
Yeah, we've lost that.
And we're gaining a lot of flexibility, right? So that we can turn things on and off much quicker. So if we can move to PaaS platforms and then we have a suitable workload, that's a really powerful story. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's one of the strongest things and the fastest things for you to do would be find an application inside your organization and look at what or maybe not look at what you can do on it, but you can discover what Azure migration platform would look like, what would be the best approach for your application. And partners like CubeSys, we can come in and help you understand what that would look like. And again, migration to the virtual, I won't go too far into this one because I've spoken about this enough, but essentially moving your RDS environment or your Citrix environment or your Horizon environment into the Windows Virtual Desktop. And again, using Azure Migrate with an integration to Lakeside for the assessment. And people like CubeSys, we can help you with that.
You're right, that session from Georgia in the week was really great, and one of the most powerful things I've seen happen in VDI in the last 20 years is taking that to the cloud in the way that Microsoft have done that. Right? So all that VDI infrastructure was often a real barrier for entry for organizations. It was too much infrastructure and it was a very high cost to get there. That's gone. We can now do that in a single VM, right? So it's pretty awesome what we can achieve for organizations in that space. But yes, we have a whole session on that.
Yes, we've got a whole session on that, and I really encourage you guys to reach out if you want to have a look at that. So we've spoken a little bit about the different projects. I guess here is the first touch on the cloud adoption framework, which has got a few different concepts in here, but you're essentially covering people, process, and technology inside the framework, where you've got a defined strategy, which you've got to have an understanding of what your strategy looks like when it comes to a cloud adoption. The center of excellence. Now, people ask me a lot about what is a center of excellence when it comes to a cloud adoption. The easiest way for me to suggest it is that it's essentially a collection of people. You need someone that's going to be your solutions architect who understands the platform and knows how to re-engineer or to rehost your environment in the cloud. You need a strategy, so it might be your CIO or your program or project manager that maintains that strategy. You need to look at your governance and having someone that understands cloud governance and platforming. And you also should be looking at someone who has a bit of knowledge around cloud automation, because these are things that kind of define your strategy and how you plan to actually push forward. So as we move forward to the planning section, we look at the assessments. So assessments are, whether you're having Microsoft come in or a partner like CubeSys come in and help you with an assessment of your physical environment and help you build that TCO, that business case that you then present up the tree to get your funding and your budgeting. And then a partner like CubeSys, we can come in and also help you with your migration plan. So we've kind of touched pretty quickly on the people and the process part here. On the right-hand side, you can see that it's, again, that flow or a wave of effect, right? So you might be picking a specific application, and you might do applications in waves, or you might do your infrastructure in waves. Some people do it like dev test, and then they might do dev first, they might do test, and they might do a pre-prod production, and then a production environment. So using this wave effect of being, looking at your readiness, so looking at your tech skilling and creating a landing zone for that environment. You're adopting it by doing your migration, and then you're looking at the management of it through operations. And then you've always got that component of governance and your security and your compliance. Yes, and also define strategy in the plan is your pre-migration. It is the organizational change management is key to this, because you need to assist your team and your organization in understanding your strategy and your plan on how you're going to deliver this piece of this adoption. I won't go too far into this one, but it's essentially just a breakdown of some of the templates you can look at for every part of those sections. And again, these slides will be shared, so you'll have access to all these links in here. But essentially, this is an area where you can look at, how do I define my strategy? And you can look at the cloud journey tracker or a business outcome template, which can help you present that defined strategy towards the rest of the business. And I won't go into all of them, but you can see here that there's plenty of options and plenty of resources available for you and your business to look at and use and more or less template from. So Microsoft has done a lot of work around helping companies move to the cloud, and then produce this huge amount of content to help them get there.
Again, I think it's probably worthwhile pointing out, guys, that at CubeSys, we really want to help you understand this and take you and your team on that journey. There is a lot of content and a lot of collateral, and it can be a little bit daunting when you first look at it, but allow us to help you navigate through that and help you adopt that new way of thinking and working in the cloud by working alongside you and your team. So that's an important factor.
Definitely. One of the main tools I want to recommend that everybody looks at, whether you're currently in your migration plan or strategy, or whether you're in the earlier stages of it and you're still trying to define your strategy, I really recommend you look up SMART tool, the Strategic Migration Assessment and Readiness tool. This is a tool that will help you understand if you've got not enough planning and strategy in place, or if you've got to understand if you need a bit more partner support, and it can give you some breakdowns on how you can improve on these areas. Like I said here on the left, it says an overall score. You're almost there, so there's some room for improvement, but you need to get a little bit more here and a little bit more there, and it can help you understand where you need to focus on in order to make sure this cloud adoption is successful. And as always, CubeSys can come in and help you deliver this piece. And I'm going to talk about the Azure Migrate, which is a central hub for a data center migration. So if you've got a project which is simply a data center project, this is what we've been looking at utilizing, and it can migrate Windows, Linux, database, data, web, and virtual desktops. So it covers that multiple scenario environment. It also has that diverse capability because it has the ability to discover your current environment, make an assessment of it, make some recommendations on it, and then also help you deliver the actual migration itself. And it gives that one space to view it all. There are other products out here, but I believe that you should always use the tool that's intended for that platform. So here's a very quick example of an assessment. So this is where we've maybe deployed a little agent inside the environment, we've connected it up, and it's gone and discovered all the different virtual machines or the physical hosts, and it's got that information out into a dashboard for us so we can understand where our readiness is. And it will also give us a rough idea of some of the cost consumption models. So it'll give us a really rough idea maybe of what it's going to cost us per month just to run. And then there's the database assessment. Again, very strong piece here around that the Azure Migrate platform has done is that you can pull the agent into your database server and it can do some discovery around the specific database environment you have, and it will allow you to understand the SKUs for performance. So for example, if it's viewing and monitoring your environment for a period of time, the more data you give it, the more accurate the output model is going to look like. And it's really good for understanding what your performance needs are currently and what they need to be inside the cloud. Oh, I missed a point here. The migrations with the Azure Migrate tool are, again, one of those really strong pieces where you can grab virtual machines as an example and apply them into groups. So for example, you can group all your dev machines together, or you might group them by application. So here's my HR application, here are all the VMs associated with that. You can perform a test migration where it simply spins it up in Azure and allows you then to test it out, make sure it's got all the functions and features ready, and then go back into pulling it back so you don't have to more or less turn it on live. You can then pin the migration so that it can be pinned to an availability zone. Again, thinking about HR and your DR, your business continuity piece. And also, it allows you to come over to Azure with a zero data loss. There are a few tools out there that do this, but it's really important to make sure that the on-prem environment, virtual machine, for example, might be shut down, but then last minute to sync, and then you'll have that zero data loss as you come across. So it's important to make sure you've got that. So, very quick summary again. So we talked a little bit about migrations are never same, simple or linear, but they are repeatable processes. And with the right framework in place, using the cloud adoption framework, you can look at making it a repeatable process for you and for your applications or your environments. We dive a little deeper into the migration paths and some of the more common migration kind of projects that I've seen and that I've been a part of. We've also introduced you to that smart tool, the readiness and assessment tool. And we ran through some of the features, the high-level features of some of the Azure migration platform. So we're about halfway here, and so we're nearly about halfway through the slide deck, or just over halfway through the slide deck. So if you do have any questions, please make sure you're raising them in the chat. And, if we can answer them straight away, we will. Otherwise, we might use a few at the end. So landing zones. Landing zones are there to help customers with the foundations. So it's about making sure that you're looking at things like security, governance, networking, and identity that's built to scale. Landing zones they enable your migration or your application from either a greenfield site or a pre-developed site to be adaptable. We should always make sure we're not restricting ourselves. So we don't want to necessarily always restrict ourselves to infrastructure as a service. We also, sometimes a solution in PaaS may not be everything you need. So it's about making sure your landing zones are built for and support that broader kind of cloud offering. And it's also about making sure that your platform is built for what you need. So landing zones are a unique concept. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail around that one. The cloud adoption framework, which I've touched on very briefly, here's a little bit more of an in-depth one. So strategy, as you can see, is defining your strategies where you understand your desired outcomes. So you might be getting ready to build your business case, and you need to understand what those outcomes are, because you need to be able to build up your justification for the project. Or you might need to build that prioritization list of what are we going to prioritize, which environment, which application. Planning, when you plan your digital estate, you need to make sure you have your organizational alignment in place. So you need to understand how your organization is going to operate and run inside this environment. You need to make sure you have a skills assessment ready, and a readiness plan, and an adoption plan. So that way you can keep track of your progress, and you can make sure you're improving on your planned approaches as you bring that feedback loop back in. So when you're ready, you build out your first landing zone. You might do this from a pre-configured blueprint, which I'll touch on in a little bit of time. Or you might use a custom one for your organization, or you might have been working with a partner who's helped you build out that first landing zone, that first blueprint. And then you might look at expanding that blueprint into another area or into another subscription. And you should always be looking at using best practice validations. Those are really key around making sure your environment is configured in an appropriate way, like we touched on before, that complement the security components that are built into the platform, and you're complementing those with some additional security requirements above it and beyond it. The adopt, so we might get a real workload built out in the environment now, and we're migrating workloads. We need to review our process and provide that operational improvements back to the architect or the person that's developing your infrastructure as code. We also need to look at planning out the next one and validating it, making sure that we're looking for issues and vulnerabilities that we need to bring into that feedback loop, which is always really important about innovating when you're adopting in cloud. And then the governance, so the methodology and the security governance and the identity governance all come into things that you need to be considering all the time, especially in the cloud where you are constantly moving, you're constantly improving or upgrading or redeveloping or adapting in new areas. You should always have your governance and your manageability kind of in mind, because the person that might be delivering it may not be the guy that manages it, and you need to make sure that they're always talking. I've had a few issues where I've gone to develop something or deploy something, but the person that's going to be operationally responsible for it doesn't fully understand the solution, and that becomes a real risk. So you want to make sure you've got that handover is nice and clean, and that the feedback loop's always there. So Azure landing zone key areas. So I'm going to prioritize only a few of them today. I think that there's a lot of stuff we can do in the operational side of it, and I've touched briefly on the operational responsibilities and the operational mindset earlier today, but I think it's about understanding the network topology and connectivity, your identity inside the cloud, your resource organization is really important, and I want to stress that one. And we'll talk a little bit more in a couple of slides around governance disciplines and some of the basic ones that I think everybody should consider. So first of all, the network. Now, I know that this slide might be a little bit hard to read on the presentation, and you will be able to see it in a much clearer detail when you get the slide deck. But essentially, this is a flow chart that's been created to more or less help you understand how or what form of networking you should be potentially implementing with your cloud solution. And it's a fairly simple thing. If it's PaaS and you don't need any VNet connectivity, VNet's essentially just an internal network of your subscription environment where you might have an ability to connect it back to your on-prem environment, for example. So if it's a platform of service and you don't need that, then you can just ignore networking completely. But if you do need to have that connectivity where you need to have some kind of on-premise connectivity, it might be the fact that you need to have a deployment that relies on a database that you can't move straight away. So you might need that connectivity. And so if you need that reliability, you might need to look at something like ExpressRoute. But if you're a little bit more flexible with it, it's maybe a web app that doesn't need to be constantly in communication, or it has a queuing system built into it so it can always catch up later on. You might look at a VPN gateway, for example. You might also need to consider things like your firewalling and your security environment, whether you need to force all of your traffic from your cloud environment through a WAF or through a firewall that's on-prem. So you might need to consider force tunneling back to your on-premise using ExpressRoute. Or you might need to consider the hub spoke design, where you've got essentially the central hub where you want everything centrally managed and all the network connectivity goes through. And if you don't need that, you might just be able to get away with some VNet peering, connecting your VNets together by peering them. And there's some other interesting information at the bottom here around more about understanding if your workloads are going to be externally accessible and what you need to do to protect that, whether it's an app gateway for resiliency and failover, front door, which is also a globally available load balancer with a built-in WAF, so built-in web application firewall. Or you might be just doing some basic 443 and you don't need to do any kind of real inspection on it, so you might look at just deploying a cloud firewall or an Azure firewall. And then there's the DNS things down the bottom around if you require a custom DNS, then you might then need to consider either deploying an infrastructure as a service VM, running DNS and maybe Active Directory, or maybe just deploying the Azure Active Directory domain services, which is a light version of the same thing. So there's a few considerations when it comes to network in particular that people need to be aware of when they're kind of bringing on that cloud adoption. Identity, so RBAC. So everyone knows what RBAC is. It's the role-based access control, but it's a really key piece inside a cloud platform, and it's important to understand it. A security principle might be just the identity. Right? So a security principle, it represents either a user or a group of users. So I'll click that onwards. And a security principle is that identity that brings you into the space. But you then need to know what role or definition of that role. So you need to remember that, for example, an administrator could be an owner, but you might have a group that only need reader contribution or reader access to this environment. So making sure you use the correct role definitions is really important. The other side of this is there are custom abilities to create your own custom role definitions, but I would strongly recommend that you review the built-in ones first, and you can combine a couple of them together. So by doing that and putting the same group into a few different built-in role definitions, you can achieve the same outcome. And the thing with custom ones is that you have to maintain them. You've got to make sure that you understand where they're going and what they're doing. And the final thing with RBAC that's really important is your scope. Understanding where you apply that permission is key to understanding, because as soon as you apply it on a management group, it flows down. So obviously the lower down that tree, the more granular the access control is. Resource organization and tagging in particular. So tagging is quite a unique discussion, but this is a guide that is provided by Microsoft around some considerations that you need to look into. So having a baseline and really strong naming convention in tags is really important, because it allows you to understand the tag and understand its definition without having to read a 2-page document. So having something that's really easy to understand, but also having something that's functional. You need to have, any tag that you create needs to have a purpose and a function, because otherwise you won't use it, essentially. And a really good example of this, which I will go into a little more detail, is more about the financial, the tracking, the accounting, the costings. So having a tag set up for that is one of the most common uses of tags that I've seen inside the Azure environment, but it's also not the only use for it. There are some other things you can look at, like classifying your data. You might have a tag set up for your data classification, which might suggest that this database has confidential data in it. So you need to have a different protection SLA against that with Azure Backup. And you might have a different governance structure or security access being reviewed and used based on that tag. And you might also need to consider your tagging around your partnerships and making sure that you understand who is an owner and who is a stakeholder or a power user of that application or that platform. So, you can use it for that stuff as well. And again, having a purpose. I think having the slide here kind of demonstrates that you should align a business function to it, but I think it's also about making sure that your tag has a purpose and making sure that your tag is useful to you and your organization. So diving into an example of tag would be the finance business case, which I think is the most common. You need to have an understanding of that resource is a cost to the business unit, and that business unit has a budget. So that needs to be transparent. It's about creating that transparency. So here, by the use of a tag, and you're applying a tag against, for example, a resource of some kind or a resource group, for example, that then tag might have a cost center in it. That cost center then shows, when you go into the billing side of Azure, that this is where this is going to be built towards internally inside our finance system. So you can create a role with a permission set to allow them to tag. So you might have a finance manager who needs to be able to tag things in the finance subscription, so that they can then tag it to different cost centers based on the team or department that's using that platform or service. And that can help them later down the track when it comes to creating their billing and creating their understanding of how it's going to be built together. And of course, it wouldn't be a presentation without a quick punt into a bit of a sales thing here. So Tag Manager is something that Qubes have created and deployed, and this is about helping organizations manage their tags. Tags, when used properly, are a very effective tool, and when not used properly, they can be really, really bad. And I might just quickly look here at some of this is very, very quick little sneak peek around the actual interface of Tag Manager, where we might have a management group at the top. We create our context, whether it's resource or resource group, for example. We've got a hierarchy around our essentially top-down approach of groups, resource groups, and resources and subscriptions. And then we've got our tag summaries. Now, this is essentially the easiest way to manage tags on scale. And I think that's really important to look at when you're thinking about tagging and thinking about your tagging structure for your subscription, because they can be very quickly out of control. And when they're out of control, it can become very difficult to manage it and very difficult to update it and change it at a later date. Okay. Now, we've kind of reached that point where we've got enough just to do a migration. So, oops. So we've got the bare minimums. We've got an understanding of our RBAC. We've got I guess a principal understanding of tagging and network and naming, and we've got a principal understanding of our network. Now that should be enough for you to get through at least the minimum of a migration. So whether it's a dev test tool or a dev test application or environment, but you may need to consider some more maturity in some of the governance, security, and the operations and the foundational utilities that you're going to utilize and consume to really build out the platform ready for production. But so far, we've done enough just to get a UAT or a test or a dev environment kind of up and ready. And I would really strongly recommend that, there's some enterprise enrollment stuff that we can do whole sessions on enterprise enrollment and deployment options, and even the BCP and DR. But I think this is enough for you to get an understanding of the bare minimums. And organizing your resources is a bit of a piece around that. So using a management group hierarchy within Azure allows you to reflect your security, your operations, your business and your accounting hierarchies. And you can then use subscriptions to group similar resources into logical collections. And then you can go further down the tree and do an even more granular collection or group of applications and workloads, by using resource groups. So having an understanding of how you organize your resources inside Azure is important, because you then apply things like RBAC to a management group, and you apply your permissions there and your security and your metrics there. Now, here's a bit of a best practice thing from Microsoft. It is a little bit touch and go, and I think everybody's need and requirement can be unique and different. But I think this is a fairly well structured one, where you've got a root management group. Now that could be your organization. And then in this example, they've suggested that you could maybe break it down into departments. So you might have a human resources management group, or an IT management group, or a marketing group, and they're going to have different levels of access into different levels of your environment and your area. So it's going to help you understand the flow-on effect of RBAC. For example, if you were to apply an RBAC policy or a group into that root management group, that then flows out to all of it. So your EA subscriptions are then impacted. Your Geo Region 1 is impacted by those permissions that you've just done at the root management group. And the other thing you need to remember is that you need a subscription owner access in order to move from one management group to another. So it's just a very high level version, but it's a bit of a best practice to remember that your root management group is the root of your, more or less, your access control and your administration delegation. And here's a quick slide around subscriptions and having a single one versus multiple. Now, people always, some people kind of come to me and go, well, why do I need more than one? I don't just have one subscription. But there's quotas, there's limitations to subscriptions, and you need to understand what those limitations are. So some of them are, really high. Some of them might be you can have 1,000 virtual machines in this one subscription. It's more than that, but that's a rough example. But there's also limitations around scalability and performance inside subscriptions. So it's important to understand where your limitations are. And you also need to consider the need for it. So you should, you might want to separate it based on a separation of duties. So you might want to have, security guys in subscription A and your DevOps team in subscription B, for example, so that you've got that separation of duties. You might use it in a context of environment. So you might have a subscription with dev. You might have a subscription for test. You might have a subscription for production. You might also use it in a weird example for end user customers, where you have multiple end users or customers that are connecting into your environment, and you might be using it as more of a multi-tenancy kind of approach. You might even have this projects. So SAP project has this subscription, and my Dynamics 365 guys or my Dynamics development environment have this subscription. So there's many ways you can kind of bring it up, but it's about making sure that you remember the single versus multiple in consideration, and make sure you're thinking about the management group impact as well as your subscription impacts. And here's some design considerations around subscriptions. So here are two examples that we can consider. See, on the left here, we've got the service design, which is more or less a bundle of services consumed by type of environment. So dev, production, lab, QA, as an example. So, and they might have all of these different they might have the same services consumed, but in multiple areas. So that might be one subscription with multiple resource groups, or it might be one management group applied across multiple subscriptions. And on the right here, we've got one that's more aligned to the organizational model, which is more around defining it by department. So your HR department, your accounting and finance department, your marketing department. Again, they might have similar resources consumed, but those resources consumed are used for their particular functional feature. Things we need to consider when making decisions are varied, but each customer might be able to use a combination, or they might be able to just keep to one of these models. And so some of the things you need to think about are the accountability requirements and the compliance and audit requirements you might have. Some of them might be some technical requirements around shared or dedicated networking. The Active Directory requirements also come into play around the clustering and the identity management tools. And you want to also think about some scalability requirements, your growth plan or your allocation of limited resourcing, and also your evolution over time. You should always be thinking about evolving your environment and the restrictions or requirements you have around that. So we've dove a little deeper into the Cloud Adoption Framework. And if anybody wants an actual session around Cloud Adoption Framework, please reach out to us. We're more than happy to go into a more specific detail of your use case and your environment to give you a better understanding of that. We've also gone through some high-level landing zone considerations around network identity. We also talked about security around RBAC, and we touched briefly on some of the organization, resource organization and governance. We spoke a little bit about our Tag Manager, and we teased you with the UI of Tag Manager. And again, if you guys want more information around Tag Manager and how it can be used and what it can be used with, please reach out and we can get you in touch with the right people internally for that. And we also looked at some governance disciplines that you should consider, more specifically around your resource, your management groups, and your subscription kind of considerations. And we're reaching into the final section now. Around Azure blueprints. So blueprints are like templates. They allow you to create a repeatable process to be delivered on scale, but with consistency. So you might, for example, have management groups and resource groups, but inside your composure of a blueprint, you have your ARM templates and your policy definitions and your RBAC controls. So all of that comes into more or less, they're the basics of what you need to build up to make a blueprint. So then you can manage just your blueprint. And then the scale part of it is about defining and delivering that blueprint into one subscription or multiple subscriptions, which is a key piece around how you then can repeat the process with consistency and with the scale that you need. So a blueprint can be a landing zone. So there is the Cloud Adoption Framework Migration Landing Zone, which is a blueprint that's been designed and created by Microsoft and published by Microsoft, which is really important that you might want to look at that and have an understanding of how that blueprint is made up together. But you've got to remember that as you build out blueprints, you might look at creating more compliance requirements on the left-hand side and more complexity on the right. Now, partners like CubeSys, we develop and build blueprints for our customers and for more common environment kind of needs. So there's always a collection of developed and deployed blueprints by customers and by partners, but there's also some really key ones around specific needs around ISO 27001, for example, or that if you want to follow more of the NIST implementation in the US and the UK, data governance pieces. So there's some blueprints around there and out there available on Microsoft's website around specific needs, but then you can build out your own blueprint by considering all of the different components that you need to look at, compute, storage, being, an essential piece of creating an infrastructure as a service. But you might also then consider your network and your identity piece, as well as your data and your policy pieces around your governance and your structures there. So it's a part of making sure that you've got everything covered inside a blueprint. A blueprint is a way of creating that repeatable process every time in every example. Now you can create a blueprint that's really simple, and it's just a landing framework essentially. So it creates that landing zone environment for you to build out the next app or the next environment. But it also might be as complex as, okay, I'm building out a 4-tiered environment or 4-tiered structured blueprint, which is going to pull out 4 different landing zones, which then creates that ability to pre-build all of your governance and security and network requirements into one space, and then deploying that landing zone or that blueprint into a specific subscription, for example. Wow, I'll get through just that much, but that's the end of the blueprint section. So we looked at some of the blueprint concepts, and we discovered a little bit around the landing zone blueprints and things to consider when you're not only just choosing the blueprint, but creating one for your own organization as well and customizing that for your own environment. But I'm going to kind of start to wrap up into some of more of the wrap up time and the question time. One of the things I was going to suggest also is before I do take any questions that have been put up, is also to remind people here that CubeSys, we can provide you with and work with Microsoft to provide you with a cloud economics assessment, where we come in and we review one of your environment or an application. We can give you a lift and shift kind of structure, or we might give you more of a modernization piece. We might look at a specific application, a specific need, and we might look to help you understand how you can modernize that piece. Also, get in touch with us if you don't know about the Azure migration program. We can definitely help you out with that piece and get you involved with the right people at Microsoft to make sure that you're applying for the funding that can help you offset that initial project cost around your actual migration journey itself. And with that, I've kind of come to the end of my piece. You guys want to turn on my camera for me? Oh, where is it?
Okay.
And we'll go into some questions.
Yeah, we've got a few questions coming through that might just give us some discussion points, Chris. So I mean, you can have a chat about those and answer some of the questions coming in from outside. Let me jump on camera as well.
We'll jump in again.
Yeah, okay. So some of the questions we're getting, let's start with a very not-for-profit focused one. So pricing, so when we talk about Microsoft 365, and so there's quite significant discounts for a not-for-profit entity. How does that work in Azure? Is there a not-for-profit pricing available? Is that one for me more than you?
Yeah, I think
I might say that, that's okay. So when we look at Azure, obviously consuming data center resources is a bit different from a license that we do with Office 365. However, Microsoft do have for the appropriately registered not-for-profit organizations, it does have a way of helping you. And what they do is they basically give you an allowance per year for cloud spend, which I think, if I remember correctly, is about $3,500 US that gets provided to you, and you can spend that in Azure, and that's how they accept discount for not-for-profits.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's an important registration process that you have to go through to be eligible for that. But that's how Microsoft help not-for-profit organizations in Azure, and then the pricing is then as normal for everybody else as well.
And it's also important to remember that those NFPs that are out there also should be recognizing or being recognized in Office 365 space as well, around their licensing in 365.
Absolutely.
And if you're not getting, or if you're not seeing any discounts,
well,
and Dynamics, yeah, absolutely. Make sure you're reaching out to your Microsoft rep, or if you don't have one of those, or you're not sure who it is, come and talk to us. We can definitely find them for you. And
it's a good point on some of the Microsoft relationships, guys. If you are able to reach out to them and work with them, we can really benefit your organisation. Now, as a Microsoft partner with a dedicated practice in not-for-profit, we're absolutely able to help you, connect you to the right people. We understand the programs and benefits, and so we can help guide you through that, and make sure that your organisation leverages the most it can from Microsoft. And there are some significant benefits.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool, that's good. On one of them you mentioned there actually in your last slide around that migration program. So we can that's done alongside a partner. So we help guide you to the cloud and help you with those workloads. We can absolutely help you understand how to apply to Microsoft to get some assistance in migrating to the cloud. And that assistance isn't just some financial backing and support from CubeSys. It also includes things like education and training and things. So it is a journey that you're going on when you move to the cloud, and it is forever moving. That's fine, but we need to make sure that you as an organisation are trained and organized as well. Now, if that is not, you haven't got the IT team to do that, of course, we can help you with managed services and look after all of this stuff that Chris has been talking about. We can make that nice and simple and easy for you, and we can come and look after that for you. It really depends on your needs and wants. Okay, let's have a look at some more questions. What do we have? So there's a lot of content there, Christian. I think this is where this first question, second question is going. And it's sort of like, we're still not really sure where to start. That's a lot of stuff, right? And there's a lot of content, a lot of material from Microsoft. Yep. What do we do first? What do you think?
I think the strongest piece you can always look at is, before you even engage in a partner, do yourself a favor and look at the SMART tool, the actual assessment and readiness tool, and go through the process and be honest with your answers. Really understand where you sit now inside your own migration, journey, and whether it's started or not, and understand where those gaps are. And then one of them in the SMART tool is actually about your partner reliance or even partner support, and getting involved with the right partner is a really big key part of that. And the SMART tool will really help you understand what you can look at.
So as I think we mentioned at the beginning, we've been a Microsoft partner for 8 years and probably helping people adopt cloud for more than 5, right? We've got lots of experience with large and small organisations moving to the cloud. One of the key things we need to do is first is get that economic assessment. So we need to make sure that we've got what you're going to be spending on a monthly basis, right? So we've got tools that we can deploy in your environment that will give you those estimates, right? We can help you achieve and understand that. One of the first things. But probably if we move to a more technical answer to that, one of the key things that we've seen with clients is so important to get the governance and framework right, so that you can control costs, that you do control security. We've gone into a number of clients post then starting to play or adopt Azure, and then when they haven't done a framework and haven't done governance, and it is very easy to get in a mess. Right? So one of the most powerful things and benefits of cloud is that we can move really quickly. We can use things. We're not ordering equipment or waiting to spin things up, right? And connecting cables, we can do things the same day. The really bad thing about cloud is we can do things the same day, and so we can get out of control very, very quickly. So that governance framework is probably before you move your first workload up there, get that sorted out. And again, we're more than happy to help you understand that and get that set up.
And I think to talk about that in a little bit of detail here is governance is not a chokehold. It is not the gateways or the checkpoints you have to go through every time. They're frameworks, they're guidelines. Think of them as like the side rails on the highway. They're there to keep you on the road. The road still moves and you're still moving on the road, but it's giving you that ability to move around.
I think you're right. So I've been working in IT infrastructure for over 20 years, and as an infrastructure manager, a lot of the time my job in big corporates was to go stop. Right, we need to like make sure security is right. We need to make sure that we've got capacity. We need to. We definitely, one of the most exciting things about cloud is that we don't need to do that anymore. We can say yes to the business, but we do need to have the right governance in place, those guardrails that help us keep it under control, so that cost and security and management are all under control. So it's a good point. Another question then, how long does it take to move our first workload? What's the sort of time frame?
Oh wow, that's a tricky one because it does depend on the workload itself. It also depends on, I guess, the complexity of that environment, that workload. Look, I've moved web apps and basic databases in a very short time frame. I can do those, in a few days at best. But I've also seen environments, blow out to a couple of weeks when they've got a little bit more rigid kind of testing and planning in place. But again, having those. I think
they're still amazingly short timeframes if we compare back to where we used to be with ordering a piece of equipment.
And I think that's the best way to I guess reflect on it, right? Is okay, if I want to do a new server or a new environment, I've got to go and order my hardware. I've got to wait 8 weeks for that hardware to arrive, and then I've got to build it out, and I've got to do all the updates, do all the planning for it, and then I've got to go to a data center and plug it in. And so you've lost 2 or 3 months sometimes in those examples. And now we can do it from your current environment into Azure, in some cases in a matter of hours.
Yeah, it really is quite amazing what we can achieve there, right? And as long as we've got those frameworks in place to do that. To maybe caveat that a little bit is that a lot of that success in that speed we achieve is because we've already got connectivity. Connectivity is key, guys. So if you're planning your Azure migration and you want to move workloads from a data center now into the cloud, we need connectivity. So think telcos. Think about how you're going to get your Azure connection there. That's one of the first things we address, because that, of course, does take time, because we're talking about interacting with telcos.
We telcos are notoriously about getting things done a bit quickly. So, and also go back to that the networking slide here in the presentation when you get it, and look about what network connectivity you need, and make sure you have a really clear understanding of that. And again, if you have any questions around that, you can always reach out.
Well, maybe just finish that question off by giving an example of how quickly we moved a large organisation around COVID. So I'm thinking back to our WBD project, and we stood up WBD for 800 staff so they could go home and work remotely, and we did that from zero to completely in 2 weeks. Right? So imagine being able to run up the servers and the infrastructure and all the security and cable and stuff that goes around that inside of like 2 weeks. Pretty phenomenal what we achieved with cloud.
Fantastic.
Okay, another question. Does cloud cost more? What sort of can we save money in the cloud?
Yes, again, if you think about those considerations that we put in place in the early parts of this presentation, you've got to think about total cost of ownership as well. So you're no longer buying that hardware, you're no longer having to rebuild and refresh that hardware every 3 or 4 years. Or in some cases, I know in the NP space in particular, you're sweating assets for 10 years sometimes. But at the same time, in a standard refresh cycle, you'd be spending money every 4 or 5 years, and it would be large sums of capital money that have to be spent in order to maintain your environment. So
So we can keep that inside the organisation and use an OPEX model to spread out those costs. Right?
Yeah, and I've always kind of targeted that whole idea of, well, if you're going to spend that money in 2 years' time, what about thinking about planning for that? And a lot of people are looking at their FY21 budgets going, well, I need to have this much money to refresh this much hardware. Well, take that money, move it into an operational budget, and then look at spending it over the year on developing and building out the same infrastructure you would have built in the cloud.
I read glanced over the Gartner report recently that talked about the total cost of ownership and migration to cloud. So it was looking over a 3-year time span, and it was looking around the migration, sort of planning and the effort costs that come with that, as well as running that, and then over to towards the end of that period, sort of turning off the data center and having a cloud post. And that was like, right sizing resources in the cloud and that, along that journey. And I think overall, to sort of summarize that report, there was about a 55% decrease in the total cost of ownership over that 3-year time span. Right? So with the right approach in cloud, with the right governance and focus on costs, yes, we can save money. It does mean a change of mindset. We can't expect to work like we do on-prem and save money. That ain't going to work. But with the right approach, we can definitely save our organisation a lot of money. So that budget, particularly in not-profit space, we want to see it going back to helping the organisation, not running IT.
Yeah, and like you said, if there's that 55% TCO, that reduction of ownership, that's really important to NFPs, because that's 55% more budget that can be reassigned into delivering of services, which is really a big piece of what NFPs are doing. So it's a really important thing to consider.
Cool. I think we've come to the end of our questions, Chris. I don't have any more. So maybe just leaves us with to say thank you and wrap up for the day. So guys, thank you very much for joining us. I'll just remind you, of course, that this video and session will be on YouTube shortly. We will send out the slide deck and all the content, and we will follow up to talk to you if we can help you at all with your planning for FY21 budgets.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much for your time, everybody, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.